My crisis response experience started when I was 10 years old. When my 6-year-old sister was hit by a car on my street, I was the only one at home to be able to respond to this devastating and very tragic event. And so that wired me differently from that moment, because I always, not that I thought that the sky was falling in all the time, but I knew shit happens. It can happen at any time, and you got to be prepared for that.
Dr. Terry Flynn is the director of the Master of Communications Management program at McMaster University. He's a veteran communications pro. We talked about leadership in a crisis, communication strategy, and a crisis that we both worked on 20 years ago this spring, albeit for different clients, the Walkerton E. coli crisis. This is my conversation with Dr. Terry Flynn. Delighted to have with me today, Terry Flynn. Welcome, and thanks for doing this.
Oh, my pleasure, Maureen. This is an interesting time to be able to share some insights that we've all gained both professionally and academically.
I have been aware of you for many years. I don't think we've actually talked before or communicated. You know, we'll get into your background, but you were a consultant and a practitioner, and then migrated into the sort of academic world. But have been in the communications game for decades. The place that I first became aware of you was actually, I think we both did work in Walkerton in the spring and summer of 2000. You were there with your company, Frontline, and I was doing some work. I was at a PR agency doing some stuff for the government. But I remember that was my first kind of, my first time knowing about you, and sort of, I think I actually worked with someone who was from your company. There was a young woman there, I forget her name.
Lisa Volpini.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. Many years ago.
Well, think about that. That was 20 years ago this May, and how life has changed in that period of time. At that time, I was doing my executive master's degree at Syracuse University, and I was obviously doing work in crisis communications. I was interested in understanding why, some organizations did well and others did not do well. The Walkerton, crisis really changed a lot of people's perspectives about how these kinds of community-wide crises could happen. But, it was different in Walkerton because it was a small, isolated town of 5,000 people, an hour and a half, 2 hours from Toronto. And while it changed our perceptions of drinking water, it really didn't have a large impact on most of the people in Ontario. So, if you weren't in Walkerton, you hadn't been there, you couldn't appreciate what it meant to be in a community kind of lockdown situations. If you remember, we had you couldn't drink the water there. You couldn't shower there. People who were, living there, like my staff, were living outside of the community. So, to have your physical being kind of altered and controlled, it's not something that we're fundamentally used to. So, fast forward 20 years and we're now living it out of our houses and, physically distancing. This morning I went to do some grocery shopping on my walk, and some guy started yelling at another guy, social distance. And I thought, wow.
I'm thinking of bringing a hockey stick to the grocery store with me just to keep people out of the perimeter. But, the Walkerton thing was amazing. I was one of those people who, I was kind of late to the party. I got called on a weekend by one of my managers, and I had obviously was aware of the story. It was like a week or two in, and he said, we need you to show up in Walkerton tomorrow. I'm like, oh my God. So, suddenly this thing you're reading about in the Toronto Star, you're going there tomorrow. Mm-hmm. So this is my master plan. I went to the grocery store. I bought a case of bottled water and a box of protein bars. I figured that would tide me over. And I was supposed to be there for 3 days, and I ended up being there for 3.5 months. But I remember, there was the restaurant, Rob's Restaurant, right across from Town Hall, and you'd go into the bathroom and there was police tape over the sink, and so you literally couldn't use the water anywhere.
Right.
Now you talked about people having to stay outside the town. I was late. So all the journalists and all of the government officials got all the nice bed and breakfast spots in town. And I was on the outskirts of town in this motel. Those shady motels they have in the movies where people are getting shot. And so that's kind of what it looked like. And it's the only place, I had been there so many weeks that the towels were so, and I'm not a fancy guy, but their towels were disgusting. These gray little 20-year-old towel. So my one luxury is I brought a towel from home, this nice big white fluffy towel. And I think it's the only time in history where a hotel or a motel has stolen the guest's towel, because I showed up one day and it was gone.
Well, it's interesting because, we stayed in Hanover. Lisa Volpini actually moved up there right on day one. She was there till December. And I would come in for periods of time. But we stayed in Hanover in a motel, and Lisa actually had her car broken into, and we never knew who it was, whether it was somebody going through some of the files that we had. Remember, we were working for to communicate and respond and engage with its citizens. So
that's right.
It was a pretty crazy time. It was I often tell the story when I was driving up from Kitchener and listening to CBC radio when the medical officer of health sort of laid the bomb that he didn't trust anyone. He thought everybody was lying. And I was on Highway 89. I thought, oh, God, I got to get there. This is going to be a crazy day. And I got pulled over by the OPP. And he said, are you in a hurry? And I said, yeah, as a matter of fact, I am. I think it's going to be a pretty bad day. And I explained to him what was happening, and we're working for the town. And he said, okay, I'll let you go, but, slow down. So anyways, I drove there. It was probably another half an hour. I got to our desk in town hall, in the city hall. And all of a sudden, these 5 OPP officers came running in, evacuate, bomb threat. And I thought, what? Like, I raced up here for this? And so they pushed us out sort of about a block away and had tape over. And, everybody was chatting away. And all of a sudden, this OPP officer that pulled me over on Highway 89 came up and said, well, I guess you were telling the truth.
That's great. He thought you were BSing him.
Yeah.
So the one thing that I you'd never know how it would be different, but social media didn't exist back in those days. And I remember, trying to get a message out to, like, let's say there's a town meeting tonight at 7:00, let everybody know. Like, how the hell do you? So you'd call up the radio station, and they were very good. They would do public service announcements, but we were one step short of going out and ringing a bell in the middle of town and yelling. And so, social media, I think, exposes some great things and some terrible things, but I think that would have been such a useful tool in those days. Like, they might have even found out about the problem earlier because people would have been talking and sharing. And so, you'd never know, but I think that Twitter would have been a great tool back then.
Yeah. Well, radio did play a really important part in those early days, but we had a secret weapon that we didn't really share with a lot of other people, because the town hall was located in the same business or building as the post office, and everybody had to come to the post office to pick up their mail. So a side deal with the postmaster, that we did our newsletters and we put them in everybody's mail slot.
Nice.
So that was the original social media for the town. I do remember we did create a website, but it was a, web 1.0. And, people in that area had dial-up. So it was never going to be anything other than a different way of moving information gawkers off the phone lines over to the website so that they could, get other kinds of reports. And we posted a lot of stuff and information that people outside of the town would want to have. But, we had weekly town hall meetings. We had, people would just come up to you and just talk to you, and you would share that information at that point. So, and talking about being on the front lines and being, in everybody's kitchens and their front yards and their town halls and their churches, that was an important part of being able to help people understand what the organizations were doing. And again, the same thing, that forget about the criminal nature of what had happened. The town and the Ministry of the Environment and everybody else were in a reactive phase. Nobody had drilled this before. There were no scenarios like this before. How do you go about and do it? And so a lot of it was, what's the playbook? The playbook is, to be transparent, to communicate as much as you can, to admit a responsibility when you could, and to tell people the process of how they were going to get their safe drinking water back. Not just safe drinking water, but water into their houses that they could shower and bathe as well. And then to deal with, longer term issues that the inquiry had found that this was a chronic issue of water contamination, but it just hadn't hit the gross amounts that had been caused by that 100-year storm that had rolled through Walkerton in that one weekend.
You mentioned that just the somber tone and the fact that the town was locked down. I remember distinctly driving in, and one of the first things you saw was this flag at half mast, and everybody was, there was just everything was kind of muted, and you'd hear the helicopters taking kids to the hospital in Toronto. It was very, very surreal. Now you have a situation where basically everywhere feels like that.
Yeah.
And not to laugh, it's just, but if you have an earthquake somewhere, you could get on a jet and fly to where the earthquake isn't. If your water supply is contaminated, you can go 3 towns over. This is, there's nowhere you can go where this isn't really happening. Like, what's your take? You've seen a lot of things. You've been on the front line, pun intended, of a lot of crises over the years. What's your take on what we're going through right now and how it compares to what people who are around today might, because we weren't around 100 years ago for the Spanish flu or whatever. So what's your take on what's going on right now?
Well, this is truly unprecedented. None of us have, unless you were, I read a woman's obituary. She was 107 years old. She was born and lived very early. She was 5 years old when the pandemic happened in 18. So none of us could imagine that our physical abilities would be restricted, that we would have to social distance, that people would be wearing masks in public. And so this is all new for us. And so organizations are dealing with, a playbook that they would have thought would have lasted a week, not 7 weeks, not 6 months. And so I think we're in this phase that because everybody is together, because we are, suffering through these very challenging times together, that there's a lot of I guess, forgiveness or ability for us to accept that this is the way that we have to do it, right? We see people dying in the numbers that we've never seen before, and we've seen governments pull out all the stops. We've seen people become leaders. I think this time has made both Justin Trudeau and Doug Ford true leaders. I think their political careers will be defined by these moments and their responses at this period of time. I think we see some companies that are stepping up to the plate and treating their employees with a level of respect and value that you wouldn't anticipate. And I think you see the through technology, the nimbleness and the adaptability of organizations like universities to sort of pivot and move towards different kinds of platforms. Doesn't mean that we really fully understand what we're doing, but we're not paralyzed. So organizations, most likely because of technology and social media, have had to keep going, right? Many in the for-profit world or even in the not-for-profit world, because their livelihood depends on their ability to keep relevant in this period of time.
So you're the academic director at the McMaster Syracuse Master of Communications Management Program. That's a bit of a mouthful. What are you, I have a ton of questions about that program because I wish that it had existed when I was growing up. What are you doing right now are you doing virtual classes? Like, what's happening with the students?
Well, the great thing about the MCM program is that it has always been for the last 13 years a hybrid learning program. So our students come on campus 1 week a term, and then the rest of it is all done virtually. So our students and our terms start differently. We start in October, February, and June. So our students were in term already. They were already online. So the pivot was not anything difficult for us. The bigger news for us is that in our summer residency in June, we will only be online. So that will be the first time in nearly 14 years that one of our residencies, our students haven't been able to come from across Canada and now increasingly across the world to see each other face to face to build that level of trust and renewal of relationships. So, the program really is trying to create connections at this period of time. Our students are on the front lines. They're doing the work. They're the ones that are working for the healthcare institutions, the public health units, the universities, the corporations, and they're the ones that are communicating. So there's lots of lessons to be learned through them. And they're also looking for best practices. So yesterday we had a online session with one of my fellow board of trustee members, Mike Kuskowski from Orange Fiery in San Francisco, about a study they did on leadership communications over 2 weeks ago, just in terms of what was the tone, what do people expect of organizations? Are organizations communicating effectively? So keeping in touch with our students, really trying to ensure that the work that they are doing, both from a theoretical and a practical perspective, are not just seen to be relevant, but are quickly applicable to them in their day-to-day job. And on the last thing, you're never too old to do this. I finished my PhD when I was 45 years old. So, I did my master's when I was 42 and we're right into a PhD. So we have students that are in their late 20s and students that are in their 60s that are taking our program.
I'd like to learn more about the program. I did some quick research on it, and it sounds to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it combines the lessons of an MBA with the best practices in communications and kind of puts those two together. Is that basically correct?
So we call this the communicators MBA. We know that most communicators aren't wired to go into an MBA program because of a higher degree of numeracy required to do some of these courses. So what we did is built this three-legged stool. We have the core MBA courses, we have core public relations communication management courses, and then we have core leadership courses. And all three of them work together to be able to advance a person from that, intermediate level in their career to a manager, director, VP level. So we're not teaching them how to write news releases. We're not teaching them how to do news conferences, but we're teaching them about the strategy, the management, the leadership opportunities that are relevant to taking careers, with the ultimate goal of being a chief communication officer.
Right. Because, I've done training sessions with a lot of people who have been, CEOs, presidents, MBA grads, and many of them, when they're done, say they don't teach us anything like this in business school. And to me, huge vulnerability, like huge blind spot, where you have these people who have the strategy and they're very intelligent, but you get them in a situation where their company is faced with a crisis and they get this tunnel vision, and it's just human psychology, right? But and there may be some schools combining those, but for the most part, the big business schools I think there's a huge blind spot when it comes to communication strategy, rewiring executives' brains to handle these situations properly.
Right. Well, interesting enough, when I came back from Syracuse after I finished my PhD, and when we originally went there in 2001 to do the PhD, I really didn't have any intention to come back to Canada, because the opportunity to teach and do research at a Division I school with 20 years of experience and a PhD, the field was open to me. But we were there during 9/11, and we had 3 young kids, and my wife is from Newfoundland, and one of the key things was to come home, right? We felt that we were strangers in a very strange land at that period of time. So when I was leaving Syracuse asked if I would go and find a partner for them. And so that was my first gig, was to really try to find out where we could do it. And the partnership started not only at McMaster, but in the DeGroote School of Business. So we ran the program for the first 7 years out of the DeGroote School of Business. And while I was developing the program and teaching the program, I also taught in the MBA program and in their undergraduate program. So I agree 100% that they didn't have any communications courses. So I developed their first 3 communication courses for the MBA program. Challenge with that is that, when you get beyond the kind of marketability of a program, you get into the academics of a program, tenure and promotion. They don't have a stream for tenure and promotion for communications managers. And so the chances of me being able to get tenure in a business school was almost slim to none. So the university president and the provost decided, well, let's move the program over to communication studies in humanities, which is really the proper place to have it. But we still utilize that. I do still do some teaching within the MBA program, but it's sporadic, and they could in fact use more of it, and people really value it. And I always said that if MBA students ever figured out the communications gig, then public relations people would be out of business.
That's true. but I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon.
No.
What would be your biggest pieces of advice for business owners, business leaders right now who are, and every business is a little bit different, but they're sitting on the sidelines, many of them. They're not sure if they should be marketing. They're trying to protect their reputations. They're trying to be relevant for when this is over. What would be some top tips you'd have for them from a communication standpoint?
Well, I think number one is take care of your own home, right? Think about the people that work for you and finding out how you can be of assistance to them. What could you be doing now to help them, rejoin your firm, hopefully, and then be ready for this new world that we're going to engage in? How can you direct them to maybe do a needs analysis for their own skills and competencies? There's so many new opportunities and new learning channels that if we need to look at different kinds of skills and communications or retraining, now might be a time to be able to do it. Maybe there's a way you can support them through that as well. So I think number one, companies need to think about their, what makes them organizations, and that's their people. And number two is then start to think about what does a future look like when we get back. Research that was done by Mark Wiener, who is the president or vice president of Insights for Cision, indicated that people believe that the most appropriate time for marketing to start happening or hard selling is about 10 to 15 days after the declaration that this is over. That doesn't give us a lot of, points to be able to direct to. But so what's the kind of messaging that we need to communicate at this point? What are you doing? What kind of connection can you make to this crisis? How can you help? Are you working with the government to be able to supply needed essential supplies? Are you helping your community in their leadership? So talk about it that way. So I think those are the first things that they have to be able to think about. And then I think you have to bring your leadership team together and say, okay, what does the future look like? Obviously it's not going to be the same as what it was on March the 13th. So we might have to ramp up. You obviously have to be in talks with your legal counsel, your banker, your financial advisors. What does that new company look like? How are your banks going to deal with any kind of debt that you have? So part of that is just internal communications and then sharing that information with your staff. And then I think what people want is just transparent and honest discussion. If you don't think that you're going to bring a full contingent of people back, tell them. But also tell them what you're going to do to help them as well.
Right. You talked about marketing and the sort of 10 to 15 day window after it's over. This is going to be a tricky one because who knows when it's over is going to mean different things to different people. But I'm watching TV last night and I saw an ad and I forget what brand it was, but there was the healthcare workers with the marks on their face from the masks and they're all looking very beleaguered and they had the sad music and I'm just like, oh man, too soon. Yeah. Like, that was just my gut instinct. It's like, can we pump the brakes a little bit because the numbers are still going up in Ontario here. Right.
Well, and across the world as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think trying to find, what is that? I saw an ad for Subaru who said, when we originally purchased this time, we were going to sell you some products, but that's not what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about how we're going to support our communities as well. So I think, larger brands are saying, how do we stay relevant, right? How do we make sure that people know that during this very difficult time, we were there? Not that we did a lot, but we were at least there and that we made some kind of emotional connection with you to understand what that is. So that when you get back in the marketplace, that you're going to think of our brand as a way of making that connection.
Don't you think people, though, see through that today? It doesn't that seem a little
disingenuous?
Well, we bought this time to sell you some cars, but now we're going to try to just soft sell you some cars. Like that's what it sounds like to me.
Hey, we bought the space anyway, so we might as well do something. Why don't we, why don't you donate that space over to the Red Cross? Why don't you donate that space over to the hospital foundations to say, here's how we can help you raise money because they're going to, we donated this space over to the government. Let them, instead of taxpayers paying, we're going to give it that way. Warren, I think that there is no playbook, right? So people are just trying to find and feel a way that makes sense to them. Obviously this is a perfect time to be in field to do some research with your your key stakeholders, right? Understand what their expectations of you as a company are. Aside from your own employees, maybe your supply chain, maybe your customers, but then also in communities, what do they expect at this point in time? And obviously, that's important information as you begin to prepare what that recovery phase looks like.
There are companies doing it wrong, though. Even just locally here, we had the EB Games had made, I don't know if you're aware, but the game store, the Xbox and PlayStation games, they made a decision. It was pretty early, but everyone had been told basically stay home, and they made the decision because they had 2 big games coming out that day to have physical lineups, and people went bananas and just went to town on them online. And eventually they reversed the decision, but it was too late by that point. Yeah. And so that one really stands out to me. Pusatteri's also, the high end
$30 wipes.
Yeah, the sort of disinfectant wipes or whatever, like just jacked up like crazy. And then when they got called out on it, I remember they pulled their Twitter account for at least a couple of weeks. I don't know if they're back yet. And then they had this really kind of half-assed apology that was kind of excuses. And like those are the things that people are going to remember 4, 5, 6, 10 years down the road. It's not like what happened, because that happened to all of us. They're going to remember what your company did and how it made them feel.
Yeah, and it's interesting because research tells us that we have these feelings for these kind of acts. We find them to be vile and disgusting, but human behavior is what it is. That if Pusatteri's is right close to me and that's my preferred store, yeah, I will forgive them. I will sort of hit them on the hands, but no, I'm going back there, right?
Right.
Because they have great pasta and they have great other things. So, shame on you. Shouldn't do it again. Hopefully you learned a lesson. But what I'm amazed in right now is how these essential services, the hospitals. I can't imagine working in a hospital right now, not just on the frontline medical staff, but in the communications end. I mean, you will remember Walkerton. That was pretty exhausting, but it wasn't really 24/7, right? This is really 24/7. And so, I'm mindful of those kind of communicators. I'm thinking about what we can do as a community of practitioners to help all those frontline communicators, to be able to recognize them for what they're doing. I'm also thinking about the grocery stores, right? Those, and these are some of the people that earn the lowest amount of money, frontline, personal support workers, grocery store clerks, right? That if they get in their 30 hours, I'm glad that, these stores gave them $2 an hour, but now we're talking about what does this mean for a living wage? So I think some of the social contract may in fact be challenged and revisited as a result of this crisis as well.
That could be positive for sure.
Yeah.
You mentioned March 13th, and that was the day that everything kind of changed. I remember I was out of town, and I remembered someone said the NBA just canceled the season. I'm like, no, they didn't. And I checked my phone and like, holy shit, that was the first one to me. And then everything else, it was just like dominoes after that. How big of a decision do you think that was from a leadership standpoint?
Well, I'll tell you where I was before March 13th. I was actually home for the first time in a week. I was in Norfolk, Virginia, talking with the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps Public Health Agency about a pandemic. And they let me, we're doing some research and we're talking about what kind of communication messages would be important during this period of time. And there was, my distinct feeling when I left there was, oh my God, we are in big trouble, because here are people whose job is to in fact protect public health and safety, and they're not sure what's happening. And I then went to Halifax. I flew back and caught a plane, went right to Halifax and did the first of my public or professional development tour with CPRS in Halifax. And then all I could think of was, I want to get home, right? I just want to get home. I'm traveling on too many planes here. And, people were at like heightened awareness, right? Everybody was scrubbing down planes. You had all your masks and everything like that. And, the 13th was just like, okay, we're in for it, right? Whatever that means. So, yeah, I think sporting events, entertainment, closing theaters, closing venues, obviously, when we think of what are we going to do in this department, I've never seen so many old time Toronto Blue Jay games, right? I was really upset because I was watching the 92 World Series and then I missed the final game. And my son, who wasn't born then, said, well, you know what the outcome is, right? Like, yeah, I know, but I'm in the moment. So them closing down sports leagues, I think, is the big indication that this is pretty serious.
But the NBA, I think, was the first one. And like, this is probably arguably the biggest sports league in the world. That to me stood out as a very ballsy decision from Adam Silver to shut down that league. And I think that if that had not happened, like that, again, we'll never know before and after, like A/B testing, but that decision might have saved many, many lives.
Well, and I think it was also because they had the first player to be actually test positive. So, and it's a little bit different. They're really there's no social or physically distancing on a basketball court, right?
No. To me, like what they did, they put safety of players and fans over dollars.
Right.
And like short term, huge hit. Long term, I think that's great for their reputations.
Yeah, and you know that those sporting events will come back and they'll come back strong, right? People need that. Psychologically, people need their sports teams to help them navigate the uncertainty as well. So you understand this kind of notion that, we want to get them back. We want to kind of have some finish on what this is. But people also realize that they're not going to do that until it's safe. And for certain, forget about the players being in close proximity, in sporting arenas, you're sitting on top of each other, literally.
Oh, yeah. So what's your take on this? There's different kinds of people, right? And I think the people who have dealt with managing crises throughout their career, it's like a muscle that you kind of work. And I think that in times like this, like it's hard to appreciate that not everybody experiences this the same. And I think that if you've been through your share of volatile situations and your job has been to manage it, that you can kind of weather these things a little bit more philosophically, I guess. So I'm hearing some people saying on one end that, this is overblown and everything's going to be back to normal in 3 weeks, which I think we can all agree is not going to take place. And then I have people on the other side who are like smart people saying there's no such thing as normal again, 18-month lockdown, life will never be the same as we know it. And I'm trying to like reconcile. I think we're somewhere in the middle.
Right.
And again, I think that we're going to be back at baseball games and the hockey games and concerts. What's your take on that?
Well, a couple of things that you raised. The people that are drawn to this field of crisis management, crisis communications, are those that actually can navigate the unknown and have a high degree of comfort with ambiguity, right? Because that's what it is, right? That we have a sense of where this can play out. We scenarioize many different kind of avenues of what it happens as well. And usually we have a playbook that we can refer back to that, okay, well, Walkerton took 9 months. They returned to periods of normal, maybe 4 months after that. But there was a light at the end of the tunnel, right? It was a technological issue about getting safe drinking water back as well. And even still today, you have people that live in the town of Walkerton that will never drink the water there. They have the safest water in probably Ontario.
Oh, yeah.
But people will not because they're not going to risk themselves. So there are some people that have high degree of risk aversion, and then those that have a high degree of risk acceptance, right? So somewhere in people are saying, no, like I'm going to go like the guy today who was these two guys that were going at it at the fruit counter in the grocery store, right? Social distance. The one guy didn't want anybody near him. And the other guy said, yeah, what the hell? I'm just getting a pepper, right? It's not going to kill you. So how do we negotiate it? As I said earlier, we don't have a playbook. Right? We really don't know. And I don't think public health know. This notion that you could see 3 cycles of this, the last thing that you want is to bring everybody back in for September and then have to shut it down again, right?
Yeah.
That's going to do more harm to people's psyche, but also to their financial and social well-being as well. So I think, in a perfect world, we wouldn't go back until they knew that there was a vaccine, that everybody could have a vaccine and that we were in fact protected against, or that we knew that the practices that they had put in place really were working and protective of people's health. I think universities and colleges have now stated that we don't know what September looks like, which is hugely, that's a different kind of game.
That's very unsettling.
Right. If you have young kids and you're thinking about, wow, where are they going to go if you are a worker that work in these kind of institutions? Yeah. And what about all the healthcare workers? What about all the grocery workers that are going 24/7? What's where's the fresh replacements that are going to come in and help them? Because I think that's our next crisis is just going to be physical burnout of our frontline healthcare workers.
Not to simplify this, but we're going to talk about leadership styles. Doug Ford, who you mentioned, not a unanimously loved politician when he was elected, and a lot of people took a lot of pleasure in tweeting angry things at him and memes. I've found even the most enthusiastic Doug Ford detractors have been tweeting recently, like, I got to say, the guy's doing a pretty good job. And then you have on the other end of the spectrum, something like a Donald Trump. And again, the millions of nuances here, but if you could just break down the differences of the leadership / communication styles between those two characters, or maybe there's two other people you'd like, I don't want to kind of put you in a box here, but to me, good leader, bad leader, if you agree. And what would be the takeaways to anybody who's leading a company, leading an organization that you could take away from one and try to avoid what the other's doing?
So I have a model of a spokesperson that we did some testing on. We identified, from a neuroscientific perspective, what are the key attributes, characteristics that a spokesperson, a leader should have to be able to make a connection with people. We actually identified 27 different characteristics, but we wanted to sort of shave those down and find most salient of those as well. And the 5 salient characteristics are that they're relatable, that they're trustworthy, right? That they are empathetic, that they have some level of expertise, and that they're credible. And if I look at Doug Ford before March 13th, I would say that he was low on trustworthiness. He was low. And remember, what was their biggest issue up until then? And that was the 3M license plate issue, right? That was the hill that they were going to die on, right? These redesigned license plate, because they, had the blue and white of the Conservative Party, right? So trust, empathy, relatability. No, I don't think people could relate to him. Was he expert? No, people didn't think that he had expertise as well. And was he credible? No. So he would score low on all 5 of those factors before March 13th. If I was to feel a test today, I would say that his trust obviously is increasing, especially when he went after Donald Trump about the 3M masks. I do think he is showing more empathy, and I'm seeing more of Rob Ford empathy. And for whatever we thought about Rob Ford, I think Rob Ford was a really caring guy, right? And trust me, that's not the political stripe I'm coming from. But I think that he was an empathetic guy. Doug is trying to be more relatable, right? Being out there, showing that he was out carrying the boxes as well. He's, expertise. He's actually developing higher scores for expertise because he's relying on his experts, and therefore his credibility would go as well. So he's had a big jump in all of those 5 categories, and the 2 most important are trust and empathy, right? Especially in times of crisis, because neuroscientifically, what happens when a spokesperson, a leader, is deemed to be trustworthy and empathizes with the people that he's speaking to, the brain releases oxytocin. And oxytocin is this, Paul Zak called it a love hormone, other people called it trust hormone. So the brain begins to wash, and then we see them in better light. So the more that Doug shows this trust and empathy side, in fact, more people will think that he is, in fact, enacting more of a credible leader position as well. So now you asked about Trump. and I really, I really find it hard to stay in a research scholar academic lane on this, because I don't think he's ever scored high on any of these categories. And in fact, when I came up with this model, I stopped talking about it. And one of my colleagues said, why aren't you talking about it? And I said, because look at what the U.S. elected. They looked at this guy that has no trust. He's no empathy. He's not relatable. He's no expertise, not credible. He said, yeah, but to his audience, he is. So, right, it's all in the eyes of the receiver. Who are our key audiences? So I think, I'm not going to forecast because I have no idea what's going to happen in the United States. But I think if you compare him, and again, we have such a divided world in the United States. There is no middle ground anymore. There are either people love him or hate him. The same with Joe Biden. People either love him or hate him. Forget about Barack Obama, right? So I think if you scored Biden versus Trump, that Biden would score higher on trust. Because of his experience. And if you look at him as his role as a vice president over 8 years, nothing happened from a crisis standpoint. Empathy, Trump has no empathy. Biden is full of empathy. He's awash in empathy. None of them really can relate to the you and I, but Joe probably does because he's from Scranton, Pennsylvania. He's also a graduate of my alma mater, Syracuse University. And he's a working class guy, but he's also lived his life at a pretty nice level in Washington.
Oh, for sure.
Right. Expertise. Well, Joe has got more expertise in governing than Trump has, and credible. They're probably at this point, and people see them as politicians, right? So they wouldn't score high there. So when's the election? November 7th or 6th? A lifetime away. I have no idea what's going to happen. My biggest issue is, will there actually be a vote in November? If you're still in the same kind of social distancing, you saw what happened in Wisconsin. I think, again, we don't have a playbook.
My general philosophy about media relations is that most journalists at the outset of an engagement are not out to get you. Mm-hmm. I don't think that they're coming at it from a malicious standpoint to try to make someone look bad. Now, obviously, there are a small percentage of people in every line of work who maybe shouldn't be there or have bad intentions. And the one that comes to mind that you would be probably familiar with is the name Jan Wong. Does that ring a bell with you?
Is there a reason why you picked her out of all the thousands and thousands of people in the world?
There is, and it relates back to the Walkerton thing. Now, I don't know Jan Wong, but I followed the media and followed the press over the years, and I remember, and I might be getting some of the details on this wrong, but there was one story where she was pretending to be on a cleaning crew, when you have like maids or whatever that would come in or house cleaners that would come in. She pretended to be one of them, got a job as a house cleaner, and was going into the houses of these wealthy people and then reporting about stuff she was finding. And people found that to be unethical. There was another one where I think it was during SARS, actually. It was 18 years ago. And they were not, funeral homes were not disclosing the names of victims, and people felt that they wanted to know. And so I believe, again, that she called up a funeral home, pretended to be a relative to get a name, and then broke that in the media, which people thought was unethical. But the one I wanted to ask you was the one in Walkerton where she sat down. There used to be this column, Lunch with Jan Wong. And I always used to ask who would have lunch with this person. So she would have lunch with someone, and she was this little petite person, very unassuming and very polite and friendly. And then she would just rip people to shreds in these columns. And so she sat down with the mayor of Walkerton. I think that was a mayor or Reeve or whatever.
Oh, he was the mayor. He was the mayor.
And so
I was at that meal too.
No way. You're at that lunch? Oh, my God.
That's why I asked you. So here's the backstory of that.
Yeah.
She called every day for 3 months. And I said, no way. Not a chance. I'm not ever going to do it. And then I think you engage in hubris, right? We're doing a great job. Things are really great, right? I spoke to the town had hired counsel, a lawyer, Rod, I forget what his name is, McQueen.
Oh yeah.
Forget what his name is. Anyways, so, and he was from Miller Thompson. He was former deputy minister of the Ministry of the Environment, QC guy, kind of, well respected, but things were going really well, right? And I thought, oh, okay, maybe let me talk, tell me, Jan, what do we talk about? And she said, no, I just want to do a kind of profile on the mayor and, how difficult it was him and everything like that. And so we agreed to meet for breakfast. I think it was breakfast. Maybe it was lunch. I don't know. It was at a B&B that she was staying at. And she had the woman prepare us a meal. And the mayor, and Dave Thompson was at that time a 68-year-old United Church farmer who lived all his life in Grey County, right? He was a small town mayor, really nice guy, stoic. I remember, I was there right at the beginning, and by the time the media came, we were doing probably 15 interviews a day, just taking them around and to each of these kind of things. And about after day 4, I said to him, are you doing okay? And he says, yeah, I think I got it. And I thought, what do you mean? You got what? He said, no, I think I got E. coli. And so sure, he tested positive. But this guy, he would not let you know, right? He said, make sure nobody knows about that. So, so I said, okay, we're going to meet with her. Here's what it is. This is an opportunity to show the leadership that this guy gave. And, he came in his, Sunday go to church best suit. And we had a wonderful conversation, right? And we walked out, and the newspaper, the Globe Mail, hit my driveway probably at about 5:30. At about 5:35, my phone started lighting up. And it was all my friends and all the people I know saying, what the were you thinking about? Why did you do that? And it was awful. It was awful. It was the worst column I'd ever written. I wondered whether or not we were even at the same lunch, right? She talked about his shiny gray suit and, the lawyer. It had nothing to do with anything that we talked about. So that's the only person I would never, ever, ever do another interview with.
It seemed to be the exception to the gotcha rule. Like, it seemed like a setup.
Yeah.
And you're trying to be, and I remember that I remember seeing him on TV, and very very relatable guy, very empathetic. You felt sorry for, he didn't sign up for this, and he was being a good leader throughout. And then the one part I remember, I think she had a glass of water sitting on the table and just kept, she referred to it 3 or 4 times. He hasn't had the water yet. I'm like, Jesus, it was just, it seemed like, if you're a journalist, don't do that. That could have been a real opportunity for her to get, behind the scenes and share some insights. And it was just turned into this very superficial, but again, not the only time she did that. And, I think that people like that end up getting squeezed out of journalism. I don't think there's any room for that.
No, and I don't think she's not in journalism anymore. She wrote a couple books, but I have no idea where she is. But I actually use that as an example, saying that don't go against your better instincts, right? Those tigers don't change their stripes, and don't think that you can, and don't think that, or don't be the person that you think can change the stripes.
I had no idea you were at that meal.
Oh yeah. Yeah, well, we were in a few meetings. I was in the meeting with the premier and his staff, and Helen Johns, who was the minister at the time, when he came up to Walkerton just before he had his public media conference. And I, again, not of the same political stripe. I wasn't a big fan of Mr. Harris. And I remember I was the president of the Chamber of Commerce just after he was elected in Kitchener and Waterloo. And somebody had told him, my dad was a former Liberal member of Parliament in the 1970s, and I'd grown up in the Liberal field and family. And somebody must have told him that, he's a Liberal hack. And as the president, I sat right beside our guest speaker for lunch, and he never talked to me once. I thought, okay, well, that's the kind of guy you are. That's fine. So when he came up, I thought, this is going to be interesting. I, of course, never said anything. I just played along. And he said, the mayor said, oh, I think we're going to get sued. And, how are we going to be covered for that? And he said, Mr. Mayor, today's not the time to worry about who's to blame. Today's the beginning of how do we heal? How do we begin to build this community back and take care of the needs of the people in this community? And I thought, wow, that's awesome. Good for you. Huge empathy. And he went out and gave a news conference, which by the end of it, the mayor was supposed to thank him and, say good things about him. And by the end of the news conference, Harris was running out the back door with the media running after him because he blamed the NDP for everything that happened in Walkerton. And I remember the mayor was going to go to the microphone and thank him. I said, no. You say nothing. This is his.
Stay away.
Yep.
Do you miss the consulting part of it these days, or is that a chapter that you're happy to have put behind?
No, I mean, I can get the adrenaline through different ways. So one of the ways that that I find a connection to it is doing research about these events. So when in 2008, the Maple Leaf Foods crisis happened, my dissertation was on developing a theoretical model for crisis preparedness. So I'd studied 500 organizations in Canada and the United States, and I came up with this model of what organizations should be doing as a way to enact an effective crisis communication response, and then obviously recover at the end of it. And when that happened, I called up my friend Dave Schultz at Leger. I said, Dave, can we get a survey into the field? Because I think that what they're doing is actually testing. We could test my crisis preparedness model as well. And we ended up doing 5 national studies on that and really pinpoint and showcase some empirical evidence of how their response impacted their reputation, but also their financial stock price as well. So those kind of things. I just sent Dave another email this morning saying, I think we should get into the field and do some work on leadership communications. How are people perceiving companies in terms of doing that? So that's where I can get it. And, there's enough to do there that can keep me occupied. And, sometimes companies will phone me up and ask me some questions, or I seek my advice, and I'm happy to give it along to them as a way of part of my social responsibility.
So few companies have a crisis management plan, a crisis communications plan. It's so hard to understand that. I've been giving these keynote talks over the last year and a half or so on crisis management, and invariably I begin by saying, to everyone in the room, can you please raise your hand if your company has a crisis management plan in place and it's up to date and you know where it is? And I look for the hands, and there's literally less. I think the highest I've ever seen was about 15% of the hands in the room. And these are the leaders. And, I joke with people that there's 2 approaches to crisis management, right? The second most popular approach is that you have a strategy and you have a plan and you do simulations and you media train your spokespeople. But the first most popular plan is that you just hope it doesn't happen to you. And I think that's what a lot of organizations, because on the whole, most of them, if you hope it's not going to happen to you, most companies will be right over the course of a given decade. And, but here we are in the situation where they're all dealing with it at the exact same time. And it's really what's that Warren Buffett quote? You don't see who's been swimming naked until the tide comes in.
Yeah.
And, do you think, first 2 questions. So why do you think that smart, capable, knowledgeable leaders don't prepare for crisis, number one? And secondly, once this is over, quote unquote, whatever that looks like, do you think that there will be a renewed focus on getting their shit together when it comes to crisis management, media relations, and all that kind of stuff?
So I started off my consulting career in Toronto doing mostly B2C work, and then moved to Kitchener to start the PR division of an agency. The agency was owned by a holding company called Gemcom that owned the Kitchener-Waterloo Record, Ainsworth Press, a number of companies. And on May 14th, 1989, the vice president of our advertising agency, that happened to be one of my brothers, phone said, "Oh my God, there's a huge fire at Ainsworth. They need you to do some crisis communications for them." And the president of that company was a old school accounting, printing guy that I remember having a conversation with him probably about 6 months beforehand saying, "Look, are you prepared in the event that something happens?" He said, "We don't need to do that. We're good. Crisis never happens to us." And the first thing he said to me when I arrived on site at 4:30 in the morning, he said, "Oh, I guess I was wrong, right?" The good news from that, it was the biggest business development piece of my business at the result of it, right? That I could say, hey, we did this. So a crisis is a great opportunity for crisis managers and consultants to be able to sell their service, because people are now primed for it. To what degree are we ready for this? What should we be doing about this now? Why do people it's the same reason why they don't think that they'll ever get caught speeding, right? Or that it's hubris. It's just management hubris. It's not going to happen to me. We're doing fine. Everything's good here, but it's going to happen to the guy next door, right? Or my competitor. They're in a horrible position. So I think it's that sense that if you've never had a crisis, or if you've never been on the front lines of a crisis, then you're not wired to do that. So I always tell the story that my crisis response experience started when I was 10 years old, when my 6-year-old sister was hit by a car on my street, and I was the only one at home to be able to respond to this devastating and very tragic event. And so that wired me differently from that moment, because I always, not that I thought that the rain or, the sky was falling in on the time, but I knew shit happens. It can happen at any time, and you got to be prepared for that. So, after my sister unfortunately died, and we had a funeral, after the funeral, I put a sort of whiteboard in our kitchen and said, okay, if you go out of the house, you have to tell me where you can be reached, because in a period of a half an hour after she was hit, I couldn't, and I come from a family of 8 children, I couldn't get a hold of anybody. So I never wanted anybody ever to be in that kind of situation either. So, that sort of told me early on that these things happen, right? And you have to be prepared for it. And so that's the kind of philosophy that, the good news is, hey, if it doesn't happen and it never happens on your watch, good for you. That's fantastic. But what I always wanted is that organizations that are prepared are more likely going to enact a response strategy that gets them back on the horse to this new normal, whatever that is, a lot quicker than those that don't. And we saw that, I looked at that in Maple Leaf Foods. I looked at it in a number of other crises, publicly traded companies. Those organizations who can limit their stock drop by so that it doesn't drop by more than 25% are more likely going to survive that crisis than organizations whose stock drops more than 25% in normal times. And so that there's a target that you can start to look at as well. In Maple Leaf Foods, what we saw is that if you had bought a share in that company before this crisis was announced, it would have cost you $10.90 in August of 2008. They enacted probably one of the most significant and gold standard setting crisis responses. And if you had sold that share in January of 2009, it would have sold for $11. You would have made 10 cents on that stock. And remember, what happened in the fall of 2008 is that global stock markets dropped 40% because we had a catastrophic fall in the world markets. So we were able to pinpoint actually that if you did it well, you could actually bounce back faster and higher than what you were beforehand. And remember, 22 people died as a result of what happened with Maple Leaf Foods.
Oh, yeah. Wow, I'm sorry to hear about what happened to your sister. Jeez.
That was 50 years ago last December. So
wow, unbelievable. So do you think that more companies will be likely to look into this once, to make this a priority, to get a plan together, to figure out how to communicate, or do you think they'll just go back to the old ways?
So I think for the immediate term, it's just like after you get pulled over speeding. What do you do for the first 10 kilometers afterwards? You drive the speed limit, right? So I think where this will be wrapped around is in business continuity, because I think you're going to see a lot of organizations actually, unfortunately, not be able to make it. So insurance companies, business managers, and crisis managers should be able to package a product that says, look, here's what you need in these times to make sure that you can continue in the event that this happens again. So now that we've seen, 100-year event happen in our lifetime, what are the chances of this happening again? It might not happen next year, but it might happen in 5 years or 10 years. And how do you sort of inculcate a sense of preparedness and readiness throughout the organization so that you know exactly what to do, right? Perhaps the next time organizations are going to stop quicker, right? Or perhaps next time they're going to pivot to the newest technology to be able to move people that way. Or they're going to counsel their employees, or they're going to counsel their customers to say, hey, we don't have to have this physical. We can move right to an online platform as well, right? Our MCM students, because that's the way we operate, they never saw it. But I can tell you, my first year students, for them moving from a lecture hall to an online platform, and I was probably, I believe I was the first one at McMaster to actually understand the term Zoom bombing, because my first class happened on very early, if it wasn't the 19th of March, and my first class was Zoom bombed. I didn't know what was going on. I thought it was my students that were doing this, and I was disgusted. I actually wrote a really nasty announcement on their class website saying, how do people do this? Why would you do this? And then I had to apologize afterwards and say, oh, okay. But so, I think we have to be in this constant state of the new normal means that we have to have, flexibility, adaptability, and the sense of resilience amongst the people that we hire. Okay. So in a year, 2 years, 5 years down the road, if nothing happens, the brain will atrophy and we'll go back to what we were doing before. And we will, yeah, right.
How are you spending this downtime? And not to call it downtime, I'm sure you have stuff going on, but like, this is a weird time. What are some of the things you're doing personally to keep yourself sane?
Well, my wife and I are both professors. So she teaches in a personal support worker program. So she is on the front lines of that. We're wrapping up our traditional academic year. So I'm trying to get 300 first year students successfully completed intro to communications class. I'm the academic director of the MCM program. So we're moving towards all online residency in June. So administratively focused on that. I have 3 adult children that are living in the house. One is an essential construction worker. So he gets to go out every day, which is a really good thing for all the rest of us. And the other ones are, finishing school or, probably doing more reading or more video games than before. So we compete for space in the house, even though I think we have a big house, but we compete for these spaces. Probably doing a lot more reflection. And obviously our dog, we have a 8-year-old lab. I think she's ready for us to go back to work because she's never gotten as many walks in her life. So she's going, yeah, I'm good. I've lost weight. I'm good. I don't need more. You might need to lose weight, but I'm probably consuming way too much news, way more news than I typically do, in hopes of getting some kind of insights as well. And, I'm just trying to be connected to our community of practitioners to be able to share some insights and help as well. So, that's my normal day, which is not necessarily different. As a university professor, we have these abilities to be able to work at home and do this kind of work, but I think we're doing it more. There's more of it happening now than we traditionally have.
You say reflection. I think a lot of people are, you've got time to think and what are our priorities and do I have it right? Or what can I change? What are some of the things that what are some of the big ideas you've had over the past couple of weeks? Well,
one of them is that I have a network of CCOs across the world that I am touching base with to get a sense of what's happening with them. And sometimes for them just to be able to talk, off the cuff and not have to worry about it, them having to be on their game. Some of them have said, I have no idea what we're doing. So they then have an outlet, a friend that they can share, and they can share that kind of insights with as well. Trying to help my young adult children navigate this kind of world, right? Because all of a sudden, these are your fatherly moments when they're looking for you and say, okay, Dad, I'm I'm 26, 27. What does my future look like?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I don't know. Like, but you can't say that, right? You can't say, I don't know. You know, you try to help them build some sense of confidence and security as well. So those are the kind of things I think, I think part of the thing is that we rush to judgment. You know, the Globe Mail has sort of slammed Dr. Tam for now reversing
the masks.
But like, come on, for God's sakes. Like, we're all trying to do the best that we can with the most available information, with an understanding of what public health practices are and what they're not. And I think, what could she have said? Look, if you want to wear a mask, wear a mask. There's nothing wrong with wearing a mask, but make sure you're not using the kind of resources that first frontline healthcare workers need and need right away. But if you want to create this new kind of mask, here's a good way of being able to do it, and you can safeguard yourself as well. If you want to wear gloves out, fine. That's, it's not a real public health issue, but if it's a mental health issue, that's okay too.
Yeah.
So,
and don't throw them in the parking lot when you're done.
Well, yeah, like dispose of them correctly. But, I think there are, so I'm reflecting on, let's have a little bit more gratitude for the people that are doing this and doing it in real time. A journalist can still go back, they can write their story and file it, and then they can start something new, right? Dr. Tam is living this every moment. And I'm sure, on her shoulders rests the health and safety of the Canadian public. So, I think we all have to put those into perspective as well. And the other thing I'm reflecting on is, why do British TV series only have 6 episodes? That's what I really want to know. That's the thing that we just finished one last night. Like, what? Come on. I got
which
months.
One was it?
I got months to go. Blood. 2nd season of Blood.
Oh, would you recommend?
Yeah. Well, it's kind of a crime thriller family. It's set in Ireland, so kind of playing the ethnic card. But it is, it's really good. And then we just watched the 9th, and there's only 3 more episodes of Homeland. So I'm worried about that. What am I going to do in 3 weeks when I won't have Carrie Madison anymore?
Right. To watch her crying sporadically.
Yeah.
Have you seen Ozark at all?
We have not. No, we have not.
Oh my God.
Is that good?
That would be huge recommendation. Huge recommend. I have 1 episode to go left, and it's bonkers. It's really good. Are you a podcast guy? Do you listen to them at all? Or like, I'm just, what would be, I try to ask everybody before we wrap up, anything that you've heard, listened to, read recently that you'd recommend to the audience out there?
Yeah, I am just so focused on the research work. So I'm doing a lot more on behavioral communications and trying to understand why people are making these kind of decisions. So I'm not spending as much time as I would want to on, the great number of podcasts that are happening on a day-to-day basis. The one I was listening to, and some people don't like him, but I like him because it was 45 minutes and he's such a great storyteller, is Malcolm Gladwell.
Oh, he's great.
And I really, and I liked it because that's the amount of time that I walk my dog, 45 minutes. And so if you can keep to that way, there's just so much information, and that's what I fear about, right? People have said to us, well, you guys should do a podcast or one thing. Oh my, like maybe what we don't need is more information into this already overladen information bucket. But how do we make sure that we get good information? And so, so the stuff I'm reading are those scientific papers that people are making judgments about whether or not these are the right kind of communications efforts in this time of things. And then also just thinking about how do we construct research studies to be able to help on that side.
Excellent. Where can people follow you on Twitter or online? What's your recommended place for them to track you down?
Twitter is probably the best place, at Terry Flynn, TerryFlynn. I'm also on LinkedIn, but probably not as much on LinkedIn as I should be. Twitter's easy, and that's probably the best way. I do some Facebook to a select group of people who I reveal my true feelings about certain leaders to the south.
Right.
But Twitter's probably the best place to get me.
Excellent. Thank you very much for doing this. Really appreciate it. All the best to you and your family. And we hopefully will do this again post-pandemic and maybe over beers.
You bet, Warren. Stay safe and stay well. All the best.
One more time, thank you so much to Terry Flynn for taking the time to speak with me. Really enjoyed the conversation. And as always, thank you very much to you for listening. Please take 1 second and pop over to Apple Podcasts and leave a comment, review, or a rating for the show. Helps other people find this content. Thank you once again, and we'll see you next time.